So if the Chinese Americans during this phase of the Cold War, during the 50s and the 60s, were cast with this suspicious light, what about Japanese Americans during this time? Now, let's remember that even before World War II, the Japanese were not trusted, considered to be unassimilable. There was a fear of the Japanese population growing because of family formation. They were denied the right to buy land through the Land Acts. And then, of course, during World War II, they were all sent to internment camps, 120,000 Japanese Americans. Two-thirds of them, as we know, were Nisei, U.S. citizens born on U.S. soil. Okay, so now we enter the Cold War, and Japan is our ally after World War II and during the Cold War. China, as you know, is our enemy now. So what happens here is the recasting of Japanese Americans as a, quote, model minority. Okay, and it's important to note here that this stereotype that the Japanese, and I have to say eventually, after the 1965 Immigration Act, let's say during the 70s, 80s, 90s, all Asians would be typecast as model minorities. Okay, so at this phase, however, the Cold War, Japanese Americans in particular would be typecast as that model minority. So what is the model minority image or stereotype? This is the notion that, in this case, the Japanese are universally hardworking, obedient, academically gifted, academically successful. Economically, they are prosperous. And you have to compare that again to the way they were depicted before World War II. Okay? Before that, well, as we know, there's the yellow peril. There's that Oriental as being inscrutable and unassimilable to the United States. And all of a sudden now they're model minorities. Okay? Now, it's important to frame this in that Cold War narrative as well as racial liberalism. Again, I have to invoke the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the USSR. And again, we have to underscore the importance of the effort of both worlds, the first and second, to win over those allegiances of third world countries. And needless to say, those third world countries were comprised of persons of darker skin. So the model minority stereotype was used to counter those accusations of being racist in our country. Okay? And the way they would do this is to showcase success, particularly had by Japanese Americans in society, right? This goes along with what I mentioned earlier, them being hardworking, academically inclined, that the Japanese was a racial group that succeeded through discipline and obedience and family values too, despite their discrimination, okay? Because it was pretty much an open fact that racial groups were indeed discriminated. So this was the model minority image that became attached to Japanese Americans during the 50s, during the 1960s, and as I mentioned, eventually to all Asian Americans by the end of the 20th century, spilling over into the 21st century. Now, another important context to this is the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, in the 1960s, right in the middle of the Cold War, Asian Americans were contrasted with African Americans who, as you know, were demanding the collapse of Jim Crow, demanding structural reforms. And in this context, Asian Americans were presented and depicted as quiet, obedient, compliant, and just hardworking, minding their own business, and just grateful to be here. And black civil rights leaders were framed by some politicians, at least, and the media as disruptive and demanding. Okay? So the message is what? The message is this. Look at the Asian Americans. They succeed without protest. So racism isn't the problem. those black activists are, the agitators. They're the problem. And this narrative served to undermine the claims of institutional racism that existed in the United States, and that all the black leaders, activists were demanding to be dismantled, right? Again, this narrative tried to delegitimize civil rights activism from those who were critical of the civil rights movement. And the Japanese here was used as a foil, if you will, in this debate. Now, I just mentioned media and their involvement in reinscribing Asian Americans, through Time magazine and Life magazine. Well, here's the New York Times in 1966, an article written by William Peterson. By the way, Peterson is often cited as a major popularizer of this whole idea of Asian Americans as model minorities. And he argued that the Japanese Americans prospered in the United States by virtue of their cultural values, despite the fact that, yes, they are victims of discrimination. And in this piece, Peterson contrasted Japanese Americans with African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement at that time. So again, he framed the success of Japanese Americans as a product of their cultural traits, right? Not due to structural conditions. Okay, so again, this is the beginning of that model minority stereotype, which, by the way, is false. We will discuss in a future lecture. Okay, it's not true that Asian Americans are essentially, to use that term, superior in academics and in their professional lives compared to other races, regardless of ethnic group. Okay, so what you see during this period in the first 2 decades of the Cold War, well, let's say the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, is overall increase in respectability from white Americans. Okay, so they began to garner more respect, which is at fundamental variance with World War II and their internment. Okay, I just mentioned the model minority in media, quote unquote, quiet, law-abiding, hardworking, academic excellence. And then you see a series of events that indicate their upward mobility here by virtue of some American policy changes, right? For example, 1948, you see the Supreme Court announced that the Alien Land Acts, which we're aware of, and by the way, California was not the only state that passed an Alien Land Act against Japan. Okay, there were other states involved, California being the most prominent, though. But the court came to the decision that these were indeed unconstitutional and they were repealed. Okay? And then another thing that happens is that the Supreme Court rules that racial covenants are indeed unconstitutional. So for this, we have to think about, what does racial covenants refer to, and how does that apply to the Japanese as well as all other ethnic groups at this time? Okay, so what is a racial covenant, otherwise known as a racial restrictive covenant? Okay, the two are virtually synonymous. Well, a racial restrictive covenant, these were private agreements between homeowners, the banks, right, lenders, and what have you, real estate. And basically, they were private agreements, usually written into a deed or a neighborhood charter. And it explicitly stated that a certain property could not be sold or occupied by specific racial groups. Okay, so for example, here is one racial covenant. And notice it says racial restriction. So when you think of the term restrictive covenant, where the racial part, quote unquote, is not added, that just means a group of conditions that must be met in order for a particular person to buy the said property or home or what have you, right? Restrictions on things you can think of like, animals and what have you, right? But race was part of that. Okay, so it's number 16 on this particular restrictive covenant: racial restrictions. No property in said edition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. No person other than one of the white or Caucasian race shall be permitted to occupy any property in said edition or portion thereof or building thereon, except a domestic servant actually employed by a person of the white or Caucasian race, where the latter is an occupant of such property. Okay, and like I said, the next one is animals. No fowl or animal other than songbirds, dogs, or cats, right? Okay, so there we go. That's a restrictive covenant. What's the purpose of this? To maintain racially segregated neighborhoods. They wanted to keep out African Americans, Asians, Mexicans, sometimes Jewish, out of neighborhoods. So therefore, they would insert these in the deeds. Okay, and ultimately, it was the intention of that restrictive covenant to not only protect property value, right, but also to reinforce racial boundaries in a given area, like a part of the city or neighborhood or what have you. Okay, so these are restrictive covenants. They were around for most of the 20th century until the age of civil rights, when, of course, they're deemed to be unconstitutional. And obviously, that is a race-based policy. So therefore, during the age of civil rights, not to mention the context of Cold War rivalry, it was felt that restrictive covenants had to be made illegal. So indeed, this was the case. Now, I should mention, just because they made it illegal, that doesn't mean in practice, it suddenly disappeared, okay? You still see restrictive covenants practiced, even though it's not explicitly stated as a restrictive covenant or part of the restrictive covenant, okay? In other words, they had to come up with future laws to make sure that racial restrictive covenants no longer happen. And this would happen even going into the 70s. And going back to this slide, what you see happening in the professional lives of Japanese Americans is the increase of, especially the Nisei and, of course, the third generation, into occupations that are considered more professional, quote unquote, more prestigious even, that require more education. So therefore, they're no longer consigned to these low-paying, low-status agricultural jobs. And therefore, you see this elevated perception of Japanese Americans by other Americans at that time during this period, the 1960s, 1970s. So again, the cumulative result of all these things mentioned here is that the Japanese become known as model minorities, and you see the increase in respectability from white Americans. And again, you have to think about the context of trying to counter accusations of the U.S. as being, discriminatory towards its ethnic minorities. At the same time, this model minority narrative or model minority stereotype also was being utilized in the criticism against the more, let's say, radical activists in the civil rights movement, whereby such activists were accused of being disruptive, unobedient, and overall, agitators rather than being compliant citizens of the United States, like the Japanese were supposedly during this time.